How do people like Johnny Somali and Vitaly Zdorovetsky get punished for being stupid streamers in today's time? Jail sentence? Well, that may sound like a lot to us, and they do deserve it, by the way. Jail time is a slap on the wrist compared to the things that I'm about to show you. The Pear of Anguish. The Pear of Anguish came out of Europe sometime in the late Middle Ages or early Renaissance, though nobody can agree exactly when or where it showed up first. Some think it was French or Italian in origin, maybe even Dutch. It wasn't an execution device or anything like the guillotine or gallows, but that doesn't mean it's not something worse than death. There's not a ton of official records for it, just enough creepy sketches, scattered writings, and whispers in torture museums to piece together how it worked and what it was supposedly used for. Most references to it pop up in the 16th and 17th centuries, and it was usually tied to things like being religiously hypocritical, mocking the religion, being accused of witchcraft, or being a person that decided they wanted to go the route of Adam to Adam. Despite the name and weirdly fruit-like shape, the Pear of Anguish was not a kitchen tool. It was a metal device that looked sort of like a pear, hence the name, and it came in different sizes depending on which wahoo it's going to be used for. Yeah, it goes into many different places, even the ones you didn't know existed in your body. The device had 4 metal leaves, or petals, that started closed tight like a bud, attached to a central screw mechanism. Once it was inserted, a key or crank on the end would slowly be turned, forcing the leaves to spread open. And the more it opened, the wider and more horrifying it got. If it was cranked far enough, it would break whatever it could break. It also wasn't meant to kill you right away. It was the appetizer before the main course of whatever other brutal nonsense the authorities had planned. Think of it like the sadistic warm-up act. And since it didn't necessarily kill you on its own, it gave torturers time to extract information, or encourage repentance, or whatever other excuse they had for playing medieval dentist with your face, or sticking gadgets up places that should remain ungadgeted. It was usually for people accused of blasphemy, or spreading heretical ideas. Priests, prophets, loudmouth critics. Cram the pear into the mouth, crank it open, and boom! Another person converted back to Christianity. Scold's bridle. Are you a woman in the olden days? Do you talk too much? Do you think the #MeToo movement was going to help you when it's hundreds of years too early? Well, look no further for your destination. The Scold's bridle is here. If you're someone who angered the wrong insecure men, also known as everyone back then to women by having opinions, you'll get this. A metal contraption that will be strapped to your head like a muzzle. It comes with a metal frame that wraps around your head like a mask, and the best thing about this is the top-of-the-line, state-of-the-art tongue plate. With its cutting-edge technology, it pins your tongue down and will surely stop you from shouting "girl power." Seriously though, if this still didn't scream abuse, some versions came with bells or ornamental horns to make sure everyone in the village could hear her shame clanking down the street. Authorities, husbands, and clergymen were all in on it, using this little head torture device to keep scolds, shrews, and nags in check. And by scold, they basically meant any woman who didn't shut up and sit quietly, like the good little background character she was supposed to be. The whole thing stinks of petty male ego, wrapped in sanctimonious bleep bleep. Some women were forced to wear the bridle for hours, even days, while being dragged through towns or tied up in public squares. And if the spikes pierced the tongue or cheeks, too bad. Guess you shouldn't have had thoughts. The bleeding, the infection risk, the psychological hell of being muzzled like a rabid animal, it was all just part of the lesson. And yeah, people watched. They laughed. They enjoyed the spectacle because society was less justice system and more torture theater back then. The Scold's bridle was especially popular in places like Scotland and England from the 1500s through the 1700s, but versions of it showed up in other parts of Europe too. Ho'enakule. I saw some of y'all in the comments in my other video about this, so you're welcome. So parricide was a thing in ancient Rome. That means you pulled a Menendez brothers or killed someone you're close to. Poenakuli is your punishment for that. A little legal fever dream. It translates to penalty of the sack. The roots of this punishment go back to the Roman Republic, somewhere around the 1st or 2nd century BCE, though some sources suggest it might have started even earlier in the 12 tables around 450 BCE. At first, poenakule was a relatively simple idea. The person got sewn into a leather sack and chucked into a river. Not exactly a Roman innovation. Bag, water, drowning, case closed. But apparently that was too chill, so they started jazzing it up. Eventually, the fully upgraded version of the punishment looked like this. First, you'd get a savage public beating, just to set the tone. Then they'd take a big leather sack and stuff you inside. But you weren't going in alone. Animals are with you. Whatever they were shoved in the sack alive. Which means you're in there, bleeding and gasping for breath, packed in tight with 4 panicking animals who are also freaking out because, well, they've just been tied up in a sack with a human. Oh, and did I mention all of them are considered chaotic or cursed in Roman symbolism? Each animal had its own twisted symbolism. So by throwing you in with these creatures, Rome basically said, "Night-night, Dr. Dolittle." Once everything was crammed into the sack, they'd tie it shut, drag it to the river, and toss it in. So if the monkey didn't claw your eyes out and the snake didn't bite you in the throat first, you'd drown. The chances of survival? 0. The chances of going insane before dying? Pretty high. And even if you somehow managed to not get bitten, scratched, or pecked to death, you still ended up dead in a river, rotting in a sack full of dead animals. By the late Empire, they started swapping the sack and zoo combo for simpler executions, or they'd just exile the murderer if they were feeling lazy. But for a while, poena culae was the ultimate warning. Judas cradle. Back in the good old days when humanity was at its peak of creativity, Europe in the late Middle Ages cooked up something called the Judas cradle. Was actually a torture device. And no, not your run-of-the-mill tie him up and throw tomatoes kind. The Judas cradle showed up sometime around the 16th century, mostly in Italy and Spain, during a period when people thought the best way to correct someone's beliefs or behavior was to impale their dignity, literally. The Judas cradle looked innocent enough at first. It was just a wooden pyramid mounted on a solid stand. But that pointy top was where the party started. The victim, usually naked for maximum shame and discomfort, would be hoisted up using ropes and pulleys. Then they'd be slowly lowered while upright onto the sharp tip of the pyramid. It applied pressure, constant, painful pressure right down there while you're up there going down here. Sometimes the torturer would bounce the person gently just to spice things up and keep the pain extra fresh. The goal wasn't death. That would have been merciful. The whole point was to make the victim sit there, hours or days, body weight pressing down, joints pulled tight by ropes, muscles cramping, with the pyramid slowly digging deeper. The area being targeted was full of nerves, blood vessels, and tissues. It wouldn't kill you fast, but it would mess up everything it touched. Internal tearing, infections, organ trauma, and you just wished you died because that's easier. And remember, hygiene in medieval torture chambers was about as solid as their dental care. That pyramid probably got reused. You might be sitting on the same spike some other poor guy bled all over. Infections were inevitable, so even if you didn't die from the impalement itself, you'd probably get a bonus round of gangrene, sepsis, or tetanus just for participating. Fun times. Sometimes the torturers would just let people dangle, with the spike pressed up but not puncturing, just threatening it. Like psychological foreplay, only invented by someone who should have been accepted to art school or something, I don't know. Oh, and for extra flair, torturers would often use weights. Yeah. Tie them to your legs or arms to increase the pressure and really help that pyramid do its job. Some reports say they'd oil the spike for less friction. You know who else likes oil? Yep. By the time the Enlightenment era rolled around, people started thinking, hey, maybe torture isn't great PR for religion and governance. So the cradle, along with other Renaissance-era psychological horror shows, got retired, or at least pushed underground. Roman candle. In ancient Rome, if you really wanted to make someone suffer, you didn't just stab them or crucify them. You set them on fire. Literally, the Roman candle was a human torch, and not in the superhero way. This was a method of public execution so cruel and theatrical, it made crucifixion look tame. This thing got its name much later, but it started during the reign of Emperor Nero in the 1st century. Nero was a walking disaster. I want you to look at Cassandra Nova from the comics, but she's wearing a toga. That's essentially what Nero was. In 64 CE, Rome burned for over a week, and when the ashes settled, Nero needed a scapegoat. So, like any reasonable psychopath, he blamed the Christians. Reasonable and psychopath is not the combination of words you'd expect, but here we are. They were a small, weird religious group back then, easy to isolate, and already on thin ice with Roman society for not worshipping the emperor or sacrificing to Roman gods. Perfect target. So Nero cooked up this punishment that made even his own citizens gag. He ordered Christians to be tied to wooden stakes, covered in pitch or oil, and set on fire. These poor people were turned into literal lampposts for Nero's nighttime garden parties. He'd throw these decadent, all-night benders and light the way with burning bodies. He called it art. The setup was simple. The condemned were beaten up badly, first, as if immolating them after won't do the job. Their bodies were slathered in flammable substances. Some reports say they were wrapped in wax-soaked cloth like candles. Once night fell, they were lit like torches, slowly, painfully, burning from the feet up so they'd stay alive longer. Screaming was part of the ambiance, apparently. Nero would stroll around sipping wine, while his guests watched people burn alive as casual entertainment. And before you start thinking this was just one twisted emperor doing his thing, the symbolism stuck. Later, Christian writings and artwork would use the image of Roman candles as martyrs, literal beacons of faith, lemao. It was basically a way of saying, horribly burned to death because an emperor had daddy issues. Over time, the term Roman candle got whitewashed into a name for fireworks. Peine forte et dure, which literally means strong and hard punishment, was this medieval torture method where a person refusing to plead guilty or not guilty would be slowly crushed under heavy stones until they talked. Or, well, died. It was basically the court's way of saying, you're gonna participate whether you like it or not. They'd lay the accused on their back, strip them naked, and then start stacking weight on their chest, gradually increasing the load. The point was to force a plea so the trial could proceed legally. Without a plea, they couldn't convict, seize property, or really do anything by the book. And back then, legal technicalities were somehow sacred, even while torturing someone to death. Which brings us to Giles Corey, the one guy who took living under a rock quite literally, albeit for only a short time. During the Salem witch trials in 1692, Corey was this 81-year-old farmer who got accused of witchcraft, probably because he was borderline senile, sued people a lot, and had a very great time making friends. That was sarcastic. The Puritans didn't love him, and when his wife Martha got accused of witchcraft, Giles openly doubted the validity of the court. That earned him his own accusation because Salem logic was basically disagree with them and you're a witch. Now, when it came time for his arraignment, Corey did something no one expected. Dude didn't plea for anything. Not guilty with an eye roll, not even a sarcastic, sure, burn me later, just silence. And since he kept his mouth shut, Massachusetts dusted off the old British peine forte et dure rule, which, yes, was still technically allowed in the colonies. So they took him to a field, stripped him down, laid him on the ground, and started stacking stones on his chest. Not all at once, mind you. They added the weight slowly, giving him time to change his mind. But Corey? He didn't say a word. For 2 full days, he lay there with rocks crushing his chest, barely able to breathe, while the sheriff and others kept saying, just say guilty or not guilty, and this ends. Instead, Corey gave the most hardcore response in American legal history. His final words may be on par with Ronnie Coleman's lightweight baby catchphrase. It was, more weight. I mean, how badass can that possibly be? And they did. After that, his body did ways that they were not meant to do. Crackings, bulgings, and swelling ensued, and the madman still wouldn't speak due to the fact that at this point, he couldn't. Even if he could, he still probably wouldn't though. Eventually, the weight crushed him to death, but he won in a way. See, if he had entered a plea and been convicted, his land would have been seized by the state. By saying nothing, he died legally unconvicted, so his property passed to his children. He basically outlawyered a rigged system with his own corpse, and it worked. After he died, people started realizing maybe this witch trial thing was a bit messed up. Wow, only by then? Anyway, quartering. Quartering was one of the most brutal forms of execution used in history, mostly in medieval and early modern Europe, especially in England. It was part of a larger punishment called hanging, drawing, and quartering, used specifically for men convicted of high treason. I guess things like just execution is not strong enough of a message. The full process was a government-sponsored horror show. First, the convict was drawn to the place of execution, usually tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged by horse through the streets, so everyone could gawk at the soon-to-be-dead guy. Once at the gallows, the man was hanged by the neck, but not until death, just long enough to make him wish he was. Then they'd cut him down, strip him, and things really started to get disgusting. He'd get his guts out. Ooh, that was graphic! Then came the beheading, which honestly might have been the kindest part of the whole thing. Finally, the body was chopped into 4 pieces, hence quartering. It's usually by cutting at the torso or limbs, depending on how theatrical the executioner felt like being that day. Sometimes they'd just hack off the arms and legs. Other times, it was more of a butcher's special with all sorts of creative slicing. These body parts were then sent off to different parts of the country and displayed as a big ol' middle finger to anyone else thinking about committing treason. Heads were put on spikes on bridges, gates, or city walls, basically turning the kingdom into a nationwide warning sign. Occasionally, the person's remains were left to rot where they hung, picked apart by birds and the elements. The whole point of quartering was to make them suffer in a way so graphic that nobody else would even think about stepping out of line. It was state-run torture, designed for maximum humiliation and fear. And, if you're wondering whether women were subjected to the same treatment, no, not quite, just burnt at the stake. Quartering was eventually phased out in the 19th century when the British legal system decided maybe medieval butchery wasn't the best way to run a country, and executions moved to more civilized methods, though that bar was pretty low. The rack. This bad boy was a torture device that looked like someone took a wooden bed frame, added some cranks, and when someone just said, "You know what? I guess I'll go full-on John Kramer now," just in case you don't know who that is, it's the guy behind Jigsaw. Anyway, it was basically a long wooden platform with rollers at both ends, and it worked by tying a person's wrists to the top roller and their ankles to the bottom one. Then, some medieval gym bro Pilates the heck out of the guy. Originally used in Europe, this thing showed up around the late Middle Ages, especially during the Inquisition and other moments of mass paranoia where people were suddenly very interested in how loud others could scream. It wasn't just about pain, though that was a big part. The rack was mostly used to extract confessions because nothing says, "Tell me your secrets," like hearing your own shoulder pop like bubble wrap. And if someone still didn't talk, they just keep stretching them until something tore. Doesn't matter what it is. Muscles, tendons, ligaments, bones, whatever your weak point is. If you were lucky, they stopped before you passed out or died. But that was rare, because pain made people chatty, and nobody cared about your rotator cuff when the goal was to get names. The English loved this thing during the Tudor period, using it on anyone suspected of treason, especially if you had ties to Catholic plots or just looked a little too suspicious while breathing. Guy Fawkes, racked. Anne Askew, racked so hard she had to be carried to her execution in a chair, and it left people permanently messed up. Dislocated shoulders, shredded muscles, and nerve damage so bad they couldn't walk right again, if they lived at all. And in case you're wondering, yes, doctors were sometimes there to make sure the victim didn't die too soon. Hippocratic Oath was being played around so much during this time. The whole setup was low-tech, but brutally effective, which is probably why it lasted for centuries, as Europe's favorite way to turn people into human rubber bands. And even when it was technically outlawed or frowned upon, the idea never totally disappeared. Modern torture just got sneakier, but the rack was one of the first devices that really spelled it out. Heretic's Fork. Dude, these names are so crazy because they're so cool yet so bad, it's ironic. Heretic's Fork is a brutal little metal torture device from the glory days of, "Hey, you don't believe what we believe? Cool, die screaming." It was basically a two-pronged iron rod, sharp on both ends, stuck between your chin and your chest or between your chin and your neck, and then strapped around your neck. The idea was stupidly simple and painfully effective. If you nodded off, passed out, or even moved your head slightly, those spikes jabbed into your flesh. So, yeah, no sleep, no comfort, just a whole lot of stay awake or stab yourself in the throat. People weren't allowed to speak or scream while wearing it either, not unless they wanted to shred their own voice box, like how John Bon Jovi did his. It was used a lot during the Inquisition, mostly by people whose hobbies included burning books and calling science devil talk. The Heretic's Fork was not all about killing you fast. That would be too merciful. This thing was for mental collapse, slow agony, and religious power trips. It turned you into your own jailer, where you had to sit perfectly still for hours or days, probably soaked in urine and sweat, your muscles twitching, and every nerve in your body screaming to just move for a second. But you couldn't, because moving meant pain, and pain meant blood, and blood meant infection, and infection meant death if the church didn't kill you first. It wasn't the worst tool in the medieval torture toolbox, not by a long shot, but it was definitely one of the pettiest. Like, oh, you won't convert? Cool. Enjoy sleeping upright like a traumatized flamingo until your soul's ready to be saved. They'd even write stuff like, "I recant," or "I am a heretic" on the fork itself. So every second of pain came with a little reminder that this was all your fault for thinking independently. And if you're wondering, no, there's no evidence this thing ever converted anyone. All it did was terrify the next guy in line, which, honestly, was kind of the point. It was all performance. Marooning. When Adam Levine sang, "I am in misery," it was true. But not for his case, for the victims of marooning. It started as a disciplinary thing in the 17th and 18th centuries, mostly in the Caribbean, when pirates or ship captains had to deal with someone being a pain in the butt. Mutiny, stealing, insubordination, or just being an all-around not a nice person to be around. Instead of executing them, which was loud, messy, and kind of bad for morale, they just dumped the guy on some godforsaken island with nothing but a bottle of rum, maybe a musket if they were feeling generous, and let nature handle the paperwork. Most of the time, though, completely nothing. The chosen islands were usually small, hot, crawling with bugs, and had about as much shade as a frying pan. The unlucky guy got to spend their last days either dying of thirst, going crazy, or having long conversations with coconuts, like they were on Survivor series. There were a few psychos who survived it, like Alexander Selkirk, who got dumped and lived off goats for 4 years before being rescued. Well, he didn't really get dumped. He just went on his own accord because the ship he was boarding was messed up. He didn't believe it could survive, so he told the captain about it. But since he and the captain weren't so in good terms, it was like talking to the moon. He basically marooned himself. But for most, it was a one-way trip to a sunburnt grave. Some captains left you with a little food or a flask of water just to make it look less like murder and more like natural consequences. Others didn't bother and just handed you a loaded pistol so you could choose between slow rot or fast boom. It was also psychological warfare. Every crewmate saw what happened to the last guy who popped off, and suddenly, no one had complaints about ration sizes or flogging. Even navies used the practice now and then, though with a bit more ceremony and a lot more paperwork. The name marooning likely came from the word cimarron, Spanish for wild or untamed, used to describe escaped slaves hiding in the jungle, and honestly, the comparison fits. Dumping someone in the wild to fend for themselves was basically forced regression into animal mode. And if you were real unlucky, the island already had other marooned seafarers on it, so now it's a club of starving lunatics who all hate each other. There's also the rare chance you'd get rescued, which usually meant getting recaptured, enslaved, or executed anyway. So it was kind of a pick-your-doom situation. Thankfully, these types of stuff don't exist anymore. But if they were to still exist today in this age, God forbid people have liberty in life. See y'all.